And at this point, when I was a kid, I had no idea that I was a descendant of a Genesero scout. All I knew is that my mom said that we'd been here for years and years and years and years. My grandmother lived in an old adobe that she wanted to move out of because it didn't have indoor plumbing. And this was just our life, and we knew we'd been here for a long time, but I really didn't know the story. But I loved Zorro. Now I know why. All right. So, to start out our story in 1828 and above, let's take a quick look at this map to give ourselves some context. The green area, the dark green area, that's the United States. The orange, that's Mexico. So take a look at that. That's only the area of this old Spanish Trail. Now, Texas became a state in 1835, so about midway through this period, Texas was carved out, but the remainder of the trail stayed in the under the Mexican rule. So a lot of folks don't realize that. So when we talk Old Spanish Trail, in the heyday of the trail, it all occurred under Mexican rule. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, and then subsequently the states of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and California were formed. So those are results of the settling from the Old Spanish Trail. So you can see the start of the trail in Abiquiu, New Mexico, and then the little La Placita is just shy, about 50 miles shy of Los Angeles. That is where my ancestors settled, and that's where Lorenzo Trujillo led about 85 families in several different trips across the Old Spanish Trail to settle in this area. Those areas today are now known as Riverside, California, and Colton, California, on the two sides of the Santa Ana River. So it was this little community was known as the National Historic Trail. We know that the Spanish did not create this trail. So let me start with this land acknowledgement. As a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, I commit to a statement of acknowledging the traditional native lands along the Old Spanish Trail. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is an ongoing worldly process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation in world activities. So, with that, you see on your screen here, I titled this Intersections, because along the Old Spanish Trail, although it is a three-branch wandering, meandering trail through 6 states, there are many places where many families intersected or connected and came together at later dates. So this is the intersections along the Old Spanish Trail that are particular to my family history, beginning in the era of the Old Spanish Trail from 1828 forward. Oh, and I put the clicker down. That wasn't smart. So we're going to start with the map that I lifted right from our very own website. Yay, you can do that. Go on the website and have all sorts of great information in that. So here we are. And it's titled, What's in a Name? And you see names that you may be familiar with. These are all names that are very familiar to my family history. That's Bruto, Trujillo, Bandini. And hey, I'll give you 2,200 acres of land if you'll come down and help me protect my rancho. And so they moved about and Alamanza. And Lorenzo did indeed live up to his promise to help protect that area. So another character in this is Benjamin Wilson, or Don Benito Wilson. A good lifestyle. When he arrived in San Diego in 1834, he married into the Estudillo and then the Arguello families. He ultimately served as a California assemblyman and a substitute congressman after statehood. But Juan was not a rancher. he tried to be a rancher. He actually had 3 different ranchos given to him in California. The first was Rancho Tecate, which would now would be lower San Diego County and the northern end of Baja California. But it was very remote. He didn't have the facilities to protect that land, and ultimately it was taken back by the Native Americans in that area, as it was theirs to begin with. He was then given land in San Diego proper, and today, if you visited Old Town San Diego, in the Cosmopolitan Hotel, look at some photos here. Here's Louis Rubidoux. Now, he's buried at the Albemarle Pioneer Cemetery, and you can see his gravestone. Louis Rubidoux died 1868. It says pioneer, ranchero, and first member of the Board of Supervisors. And he's buried in this little church, in this little cemetery that was created in 1854 and was around until about 1965, and it is now closed. But Louis Rubidoux was a French-Canadian immigrant to the United States, so that he and his brother Antoine were fur trappers and traders, and he moved west. Antoine stayed in the Fort and Compadre area, which is now Delta, Colorado. And Louis journeyed to Santa Fe, New Mexico. He became a Mexican citizen. He married Guadalupe de Garcia y Noriega, and they had 9 children. And his daughter, Benigna Rubidoux, ultimately married Juan Trujillo, a grandson of Lorenzo Trujillo, and is in our line as well. So I never knew I had that connection to Louis Rubidoux. I didn't know that he was mayor of Santa Fe in 1839, that he had made several trips across the Old Spanish Trail with Lorenzo, and that he purchased, well, I didn't know that he did purchase Jurupa Rancho from Juan Bandini, and he moved his family to the Jurupa Rancho in California. Now, what's significant about Louis is that he interacted very well with the burgeoning city of Riverside once it started to establish itself in the 1870s. And so there is a community named after him, Rubidoux, California. It's an unincorporated area of the county. And the Peace Tower that you see in the middle there is Mount Rubidoux. So we have a small, well, it's a pretty good sized hill. People like to climb up it. It's a good hiking place. Mount Rubidoux named after him. So we had those connections, and you can see Fort and Compadre there. Talk to our Colorado folks, and when you get there, it's a great place to go. And you can see our thing there. So all these intersections that were happening in history in my line that I didn't know about. Okay. So this is the, back there. Here we go. So this was the 1862 version of the Trujillo adobe, and you see some Trujillo descendants sitting here, standing there. As I said, the original 1842 adobe was washed away. So this is the 1862 version. What's left of it now is about just this wall and this front wall and this further side wall. The roof has collapsed, and just kind of an insert. Just this year, the Trujillo adobe was named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 11 Most Endangered Places. So we're really tickled to have that designation. We hope it will help us to preserve that. This was the Trujillo School in about 1875. And in amongst the students and parents pictured here, there's a man that you can't see holding a baby. His name is James Rowe. He was the teacher. He was also the founder of the Press Enterprise, which is the local newspaper that still survives today. So, in these 7 children, Lorenzo and Maria had 4 sons: Teodoro, Doroteo, Esquipula, Julian, and then daughters Gertrudis and Maria and Matilda. And I am a descendant of Gertrudis. Now, Gertrudis was Lorenzo's daughter, as I said. She married into the Juan Felipe Peña family. Gertrudis was the second wife of Juan Felipe Peña. And you remember Juan Felipe Peña from the Peña adobe up in Vacaville that we just heard about. I've had several conversations with people here today about families and our history and how sometimes our parents don't share the whole story with us because they think they don't know, that we shouldn't know because we're children. You know what? But we're all grown up now, aren't we? So now we can share those stories. But I never knew this story. And Gertrudis was the second wife of Juan Felipe Peña. My grandmother grew up, or was born in Vacaville. I could never figure out. We have always been in Riverside. None of us were ever in Vacaville. Why my grandmother was born in Vacaville? Well, her mother was Cesaria Peña, and she was a granddaughter of Gertrudis and Juan Felipe Peña. So she obviously went up to Vacaville to be with her mom. I don't think she was planning to have the baby up there, but she did. So that's how my grandmother came to be born in Vacaville. It answered a question for me that I had always pondered. It's like, why was that happening? So their son, Gertrudis and Juan Felipe Peña's son, Juan Peña, married Juana Berrieza. Okay, there's another name we just heard, Lake Berrieza, Rancho Las Putas, and the Berrieza brothers. So that connected us to that family. Their daughter, Cesaria Peña, who is my great-grandmother, her first husband was Paul Triva. And they recognize and honor Lorenzo Trujillo. He was one of the first folks who were buried in a cemetery. And over the years, 111 years of it being a working cemetery, the cemetery was closed in the 1960s, as I mentioned earlier. His grave was lost, so we didn't know where his grave was in the cemetery, but we knew it was there. So cousin Lenny Trujillo gathered descendants together and raised funds to build a monument to Lorenzo as community builder. And they erected a 10-foot cross, and I know you can't see it, but you can see it later. I wear a replica of that monument around my neck. And it's this little 8-pronged form of a Latin cross. So when that came together, many of the descendants came together, about 111 of all the various families that I mentioned, and we all met at the cemetery. And they all had a chance to visit the graves of their loved ones that were buried there. And my cousin Darlene Trujillo Elliott and Suzanne Armas and myself came together, and we looked around and we saw an aging population of descendants, and we knew that this story needed to be shared. We knew that they had tried, although unsuccessfully, to share this story to get some recognition for not only the cemetery, but for the communities of Aguamanza and La Placita de los Trujillos and the Trujillo Adobe. So we knew it was our turn to take up the mantle and do that. And so during this journey, we learned of the Old Spanish Trail Association and the connection of the cemetery of Aguamanza and the Trujillo Adobe and La Placita to the trail. So all of these things came together in this intersection, and we decided that we needed to move forward. So in doing that, we formed a 501c3 nonprofit called Spanish Town Heritage Foundation. When, in the early days, prior to the founding of the city of Riverside, La Placita and Aguamanza were just that. They were twin communities on the north and south side of the Santa Ana River. As Riverside, founder John North and Sam Evans and others came to Riverside and founded their first silkworm colony that didn't work, and then later their very successful orange growing industry. They constructed the Mile Square, which in the city of Riverside now is 1st Street to 14th Street. And they knew of the colony of the little town of La Placita and Aguamanza, and likely when John North came out west to scout the area, stayed at La Placita because there was nowhere else to stay. But the two communities didn't communicate well. There were language barriers. Of course, Spanish was spoken in La Placita and Aguamanza. English was spoken in the burgeoning city of Riverside. There was also some cultural differences. La Placita and Aguamanza had open grazing, so there were no fences. And so when the folks in Riverside were gardening and raising crops and La Placita and Aguamanza animals came by to graze and ate their gardens and their crops, that didn't make for good neighbor policy. So there were some differences there. There were some water rights issues in the future of that too, but the Riversiders named the little colony Spanish Town because that's where Spanish was spoken, so that was that name. And that was not a good name. Many of the La Placita and Aguamanza descendants were not happy when we chose the name Spanish Town Heritage Foundation for this foundation because it was a denigrating name to them and they didn't like it. But we felt that if we're going to tell this story, we have to tell all the sides of this story. And we moved forward with it. So kind of fast forward to telling our story and moving onward. In 2011, when we met at Aguamanza Cemetery and we saw that we needed to do something, we formed this foundation. We also decided that we had to tell our story in some way where we could reach a lot of people all at once. So we decided how you get people to your house to tell them something. You offer them food, right? Say, come on by, I'll feed you, I'll give you some snacks, some coffee, something. Well, we thought we'll have a community-wide festival and let's have a tamale festival. So we started that. We knew that Indio, California had been doing a tamale festival for 20 years. So we visited their festival and we scooped up all sorts of good ideas and contacts and came back and started the festival in 2013 to visit there. So Juan Felipe Peña and Juan Manuel Vaca, again, travelers across the Old Spanish Trail who made their way up the coast to help settle inland California. So back to my family and these intersections. How did these people interact with one another? How did it all come to pass? As I said, Lorenzo, or Juan Manuel Lorenzo Trujillo, was a Genízaro, a Native American raised in Spanish tradition, who married Maria Dolores Archuleta. They had 7 children, all in the Santa Fe Abiquiu area. His job was a scout, and he guided his family and 10 additional families along the Old Spanish Trail to ultimately establish La Placita de los Trujillos and Aguamanza in the early 1840s. This is a picture of the church. He was a man of great faith. His first action once he got to the area was, after building homes, was to build a church. So he petitioned the Archdiocese of Monterrey to build a church. It was named San Salvador de Jurupa. And you can see on it a bell hanging right there. That was the bell. There was no tower to house the bell, so it was hung on a tree limb, like a post here, right? He built the Trujillo adobe. This is the 1862 version because the 1842 version of the Trujillo adobe was washed away in the flood of 1862. Oh my gosh, that's mine. Excuse me. Belleza in 1843 by the Mexican governor. And you can see that little black and white picture up there. That was Red Punta Creek in Rancho Las Putas. And today it's Lake Belleza. And it was given to them at this point. And these two were gamblers as well. It seems we need to be gamblers anonymous out there. Because it was the Wild West. There was, a gold rush that happened in between, lots of money, and these brothers gambled away their land as well. But today was to share the story. We started a connections booth, and this is where we asked all our family descendants to come and to bring their pictures, their memorabilia, their stories. Our cousin Lenny would bring his computer, and Lenny has done serious genealogy work. And you can give him a name, and if you're connected to the Trujillo family and all its branches in any way, he'll tell you. So we did that, and we started this campaign. We would talk to anybody and anyone who would listen and tell our story. We have had some successes, and people will say, well, how did you do that? And our mantra is, well, we just talk to people so long that they finally do something just to make us go away. And that's a good way to do it. Just keep talking and keep talking nicely, and you'll finally do something. So we formed the Tamale Festival. We've been working towards that. If you've read your recent issues of Spanish Traces, you know that we as I said earlier, were named to the 11 most endangered places list by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We were able to work with the Riverside Mayor and City Council to rename Orange Street, the street that led from Riverside to Spanish Town, back to its original name, which is Spanish Town Road. So that way when people see that, they can ask, why is that Spanish Town Road? It used to be Orange Street. So we want to be able to tell them that story when they ask that question. We are working right now with the County of Riverside to see if we can build a park around the adobe as was originally planned. So our stake in the game is that, and our connection to that is the Old Spanish Trail, because no one would have gotten here or gotten there without, and gotten here as well without walking along the Old Spanish Trail. So that's my intersections, and I know, as you said, we have more ever here in the audience, but this trail is important. We can't let that story fade away. Thank you to the Nevada chapter, to Nicole, to Ashley, and Glenn, and all involved in marking the trail here with those lovely obelisks. We have one in California. Thank you, Ashley, for donating the obelisk. It's at the Agua Mansa Pioneer Cemetery. So we hope to have more. And I talked with Aiden after the presentation that maybe we need to add that one to that list. So, well, that concludes my part of the presentation of the trail and my family histories. Are there any questions or any comments that anyone would like to make? Oh, sorry, way over here.
Did you say you were related to Benjamin Benito Wilson?
Not related. He was a friend of Lorenzo's.
Okay.
It was due to his ruling that our family was able to keep the lands that were given to him by Juan Bandini.
You're probably aware of this, but just in case some are not, he was the grandfather of one of the greatest characters in American history, George S. Patton.
That's right. Benjamin Wilson was the grandfather of General George S. Patton. See, you just never know. It's so exciting. Yes, sir.
A question that I've had since I began passing the creek when I was a young college student. Really los putas. Rancho los putas. Why?
Okay, and I asked that too because when I was growing up, that was a bad word.
Yeah.
Okay. And now we have male and female. So, Jack, do you know the answer?
No, but I was going to ask you if you would repeat the question.
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry.
I'll stand up even. Can you hear me, Ashley?
Yeah.
Up there in Northern California, below Lake Berryessa. We call it Berryessa. We don't put a good accent on it.
The close names and when you're doing your genealogy. Oops. There we go. So there we are. That's the Old Spanish Trail going through 6 states. I remember growing up, one of our Sunday activities was we liked to go for a drive. Well, my parents liked to go for a drive. I had to go. I got to sit in the back seat and get car sick, so I remember that a lot. But I always wondered when we would pass other cars as we were driving along, if there were other families in these cars who had different histories than us, that were going different places, that I knew they all had moms and dads and sisters and brothers and grandmothers and grandfathers, and they all had a different story, and I was always very curious about what their stories might be. And I always wondered, would we ever cross paths with these people in the future? You just never know. And it's very similar to those families crossing the Old Spanish Trail. Many expeditions coming from the Abiquiu and Santa Fe, New Mexico area to settle in California. I almost said here in California. We're not here in California, we're here in Nevada. To settle in California because Los Angeles was the end of the trail. I often wondered when I started looking at my own personal family story how some of these characters came together. How did a French-Canadian fur trapper become mayor of Santa Fe? How did a Henny Sutter, a servant, become a renowned scout and leader and community builder? And how did I have to read my own writing here. Louis and Antoine Rubidoux, and I know, where's my Colorado friends? Colorado, yeah, there we are. Antoine Rubidoux, very important, and founding Fort Uncompahgre. And at a past trail conference, we got to visit there, which was really exciting. But Antoine's brother Louis continued along the trail and ultimately wound up in California. And then Lorenzo Trujillo, my sixth great grandfather, the scout who guided many families across the trail. Juan Bandini, a character who came to California by ship and landed in San Diego. Benjamin Wilson, someone who came from the East Coast and wound up in California. Juan Manuel Cabeza de Vaca, who came forward and came to Los Angeles and up the state of California to end up in Vacaville. The Berryessa brothers. All these characters found their way across the Old Spanish Trail and connected to my family in one way or another. So that was really exciting for me. How many? Sixth generation descendant of the Old Spanish Trail. My third great grandfather, Lorenzo Trujillo, was a scout. He was at Genízaro, and you'll hear more about how Genízaros created the Old Spanish Trail tomorrow during Ashley's presentation. So I am looking forward to that. So what does Genízaro mean? And it's spelled Genizaro, and it is a Native American who was raised in a Spanish household and acculturated to Spanish traditions. Now, we don't know how they came to be. I don't know how Lorenzo came to be in the Trujillo household. So she went to her brother, who was a Peña, because the Peñas had land grant just about a quarter of a mile down the road, part of the land grant. She went to her older brother and she said, I want my share of the Peña land. He gave her a quarter of an acre on Orange Street. And so she built her new house and they sold the adobe, not to anyone who was historically minded, just to another family who wanted a house to live in, who didn't mind that the restaurant was right on the back door. And they lived in there for 10 years. And the Snyders then sold it to another descendant. And she was planning to turn the adobe into a museum and to build a park around it, but she had some devastating life changes and she was unable to do so. So she thought, I'll sell it to the county park system, and they, with the proviso that they will build this park around it. So she sold it to the parks for $1. The county park system promised that they would build a park around it and maintain the adobe, and they started out doing just that. They received some grant funds from the California Humanities and the National Endowment, and they had some programs going. But then the grant funds ran out. We had a series of years of very wet weather. The roof fell in the adobe. We lost some walls. All of a sudden in the 80s, the county had no budget, no money, no plans, and the adobe continued to go downhill. So about in 2012, there was a group of stalwart Trujillo family members and all the family members from La Placita, the Bacas, the Espinosas, the Velardes, the Myers, the Garcias, the Espinosas, who all still live, some of their descendants lived in the area, who were gathered together at the Aguamanza Pioneer Cemetery, Lorenzo Trujillo. So we kind of went this zigzagging line through different lines of Trujillos here. But Juan Trujillo's mother was Benigna Rubido, daughter of Louis Rubido. So who knew I was connected to the Rubidos? It's like, oh, here we are. And then Cecilia and Paul's daughter, Irene Pauline, who was was with my grandmother, married Walter Baca. And these are the Bacas. Now, I remember him telling me when we would watch Disney together, because we'd watch Zorro together, that our name was originally Cabeza de Vaca. And I thought, well, that's weird. Okay, I'm not telling anybody at school because they're going to say that's weird. But we talked about it, and so then as I'm doing some research and I'm finding out that we mentioned in the slide previous that Juan Manuel Vaca, who owned land up in Vacaville and who Vacaville is named after, was actually Cabeza de Vaca. So we have connections there as well. So their son, Walter Walker Jr., had a daughter with Barbara Best, and that would be me. So that's my story, and that's my family connections, and they all happened along the Old Spanish Trail. And I mentioned earlier that some of these questions are really kind of fun because you just don't know well, now we can find out where we've been. It's always been my supposition that you won't know who you are until you know where you've been or where your family has been. So, what if none of these intersections had happened? What if none of these people had met? Would I still be here? I don't think so. You know, I might be here, but I would be another iteration of me. So I'm very happy to have learned this story, to have found this group called the Old Spanish Trail Association, to see that each and every one of you have a connection. My friend Donna and Keith Oldenkamps are here, and Donna and Keith Donna has a story. She's a descendant of the Cornelius Jensen Mercedes Alvarado marriage from our very own community in Aguamanza in La Placita. Claudio Chacon is here, who can tell you a story about resting springs along the trail. And Noli Trujillo, more Trujillos back in the back here. We've got so many, and Deborah Teresina, we've got so many wonderful stories, but we're all connected to the trail. So what really warms my heart is to see people like Aiden, who took interest in the trail, who got interested because of looking for markers and learning the history. And that's what we want to do. We want to engender that love of the trail and love of the people who are connected to it. Paula, thank you for all that you do over at SUU to continue this organization and continue telling this story. I want to share with you a little bit more about the Trujillo Adobe, now in Riverside, California, originally called La Placita, the home of Lorenzo Trujillo. It was the hub of the community. Lorenzo rose to be the unofficial mayor or the alcalde of La Placita. Everyone looked to him as leader. It's not a position that he ever really wanted, but they saw him as leader, as he was the scout who had guided them across the trail and gotten them to their ultimate destination. He was the person who contacted the archdiocese to build a church. He was a man of great faith. He was insistent upon education. He made sure that our little community had a teacher. Our first teacher at the Trujillo School that you saw a picture of was James Rowe. They then later hired Alice Rowan, who was the first African-American teacher to teach in California, and certified as a teacher in the late 1870s at the State Normal School, which is now called UCLA. She's the first certified African-American teacher. This happened in our little community of La Placita de los Trujillos. So these are all wonderful things, all brought about by a man, Lorenzo Trujillo, who was, as I said, raised in the Spanish traditions, who was a man of great faith, who knew that education was important, who knew that his family wanted to achieve what we now call the American dream, but it was their dream. It was a Genisaro dream too, to own land, not just to work the land, to be landowners and community builders. So I am truly humbled to have learned this history, to share that history. And I think we all need to share our individual histories as it relates to the trail to as many people as we can. In our community, the story of the Trujillo Adobe and the Old Spanish Trail was largely unknown until about 10 or 11 years ago. The Trujillo Adobe was made a landmark by the county in 1968. The county, Riverside County, took over ownership in. And then there you see is Juan Manuel Vaca and Juan Felipe Peña. These two gentlemen were granted a land tract that was Rancho Los Putos. Okay, so we have a female Las Putas and a male Los Putos, two ranchos right next to one another. Now that's complicated when you're looking at history. But so Juan Manuel Vaca and Juan Felipe Peña journeyed across the Old Spanish Trail and up to the Napa Valley. Now the Napa Valley is home to the Patwin and Ululato triblet in Vacaville. And Vacaville was named because Juan Manuel Vaca was the last holdout to sell his property to create the city. And I'm guessing the negotiations were that it be named after that trail. And he lived on the Harupa Rancho as well. Now, as I just told you, Lorenzo's duty at this point was to help guard the Harupa Rancho. And so he and Benjamin Wilson were buddies. They were neighbors, they were colleagues, and they were out on trying to protect the rancho during a raid from Chief Wakara one day, and Benjamin Wilson was struck with an arrow. So the story goes that Lorenzo pulled the arrow out and sucked the poison out of the wound and ultimately saved Benjamin Wilson's life. Well, Benjamin Wilson later became the mayor of Los Angeles. So, as I said, he purchased some of the Harupa Rancho from Bandini. He was a fur trapper from Tennessee. He married into the Yorba family. Anybody ever heard of Yorba Linda, California? Okay, there you go, Yorba Rancho. And he was a friend of Lorenzo Trujillo. So this comes into play much later in life when once again Juan Bandini has some gambling debts, and so he has to sell the remainder of his property to pay off his gambling debts. And then he came back and tried to sue Lorenzo and the families to get the property that he gave them back because he said it was his. Anyway, so what happened was the adjudicator at that point was the mayor of Los Angeles. And who was that? That was Benito Wilson. So Benito, or Benjamin, had firsthand knowledge that Lorenzo had indeed lived up to what was required of him in that land grant, was that he had protected the Harupa Rancho, and so Juan Bandini's request was denied. Thank you.